Hi guys! Today I'm going to show you how to make this cute summery drawstring skirt on a circular knitting machine. I was inspired by a sewing project that involves gathering, so I wanted to make something similar but with knit panels. I really like that this has a stretchy waistband and you can adjust where it sits with the drawstring. This is a project that's easy to adjust the sizing since you can knit more or less rows to make it wider or smaller. You can also make the ruffle section longer or shorter, and if you want to get creative, you can even do multiple layers. So let's get started. For materials, you'll need about 200 grams of yarn. I used these two skeins by Patons. This is a size 4 medium weight acrylic yarn. I found this yarn drapes a little bit different from the white yarn, so if you want the ruffles to show more, I'd recommend getting a yarn that's a little bit more drapey, like Karen's Simply Soft. As you can see with the white one, the ruffles are slightly more apparent. The excess from the white skirt is actually what I'll use for the drawstring. I'll also need some waist yarn for the knitting machine, pretty much any yarn you don't mind cutting up. A 48 hook knitting machine. You can also do this on a 40 or 42 machine. Scissors, yarn needle, a 5mm crochet hook for securing ends, and some measuring tape to measure the size of your hips. For the construction, I'll first calculate the stitch and row counts. I measured the midpoint between my hips and waist. This is around where I want the middle of the waistband to sit. Mine was 32 inches, so I'm going to multiply that by the gauge. For most medium weight yarns on the knitting machine, this will be around 4 rows to an inch and 4 stitches to an inch, so that's what I'm going to use, but if you like, you can always calculate your own gauge. So for the length of my waistband, it will be 32 inches times 4 rows per inch, so it'll be 128 rows. I'm going to be using the tube setting, so this will be all 48 hooks, and it'll be 6 inches in height. For the ruffle section, since there's a little bit of curling at the ends, I would recommend adding an extra inch for wherever you want it to end. This is how I got 9 inches. So 9 times 4 will be 36 stitches. For the length, I will do twice the amount of rows I did for the waistband, so 128 times 2 will be 256 rows. And if you'd like, you can screenshot this frame to fill it with your own measurements. So here are the dimensions I'll be using. I usually wear a size medium. Alright, so I'm going to start by casting on with my waist yarn. So since the waistband is going to be a tube, I'm going to weave in between each hook until I get to hook 1. Okay, and now that I'm at the first hook again, I'm going to place it in the yarn guide, and then I'm going to use a moderate tension position, which is just in the first one and then out to the second one. Now I'll knit 8 rows with my waist yarn to create a base. I asked you guys on my Instagram before if you like working with waist yarn or not, and most of you prefer it, so I'll keep doing that for future videos. Now that my base is done, I'm going to switch to my working yarn, and I cut and remove the waist yarn from the yarn guide. I'm kind of weird and I like to leave a long tail end on my working yarn because this is what I'll be using to secure the ends later, which minimizes the number of tail ends to weave in at the very end. Now I'll go ahead and knit 128 rows. Once I get there, I'll cut my yarn with a long tail end once again. I'll switch back to my waist yarn and knit another base of 8 rows. Once that's done, I'm just going to cut and remove the yarn from the yarn guide, and then release my work by turning past all the hooks twice. I did have a few drop stitches I had to fix, but I saved them with stitch markers. Now I'm going to set that aside and work on the drawstring. I took 6 6-foot lengths of this white yarn, and I just braided it all the way down and secured it with knots. Now back to the waistband. I placed a stitch marker in the 24th loop from the end, and I'll also do it on the other side. This is just so I know where the waistband would fold in half. Now I'll feed my drawstring into the tube and slide it to where the stitch markers are. Now I'll bring out my crochet hook and work on securing the first and last row. The last green loops here. And I'll be slip stitching these two sides together using the long tail end I left. And once I get to the last 8 stitches, I'm going to slip stitch these individually. And that'll leave an opening for my drawstring. This works really well in case you wanted to use something thicker like an I-cord. And then afterwards, I just chained 1 and pulled my yarn through to fasten off. Now that these ends are secure, I can remove the waist yarn. Here is one side down, and I'll just repeat the same steps on the other side. So here is my waistband so far. Now I'm going to fold this over so that the seam is on the side. And I'm going to be moving my drawstring to the center of the front. To do that, I'm going to put a stitch marker on the 2 ends to join the drawstring. So I've just pinpointed which stitch one side of the drawstring is going to come through. I'll insert my hook through this stitch and very gently pull the drawstring out. I'm just very careful not to snag any of the knit loops. On the seam side, I'll gently feed the stitch marker through. Now that they're out, I can remove the stitch marker, and then I'll do the same thing to remove the other side of the drawstring. Then I'll sew these 2 sides together using a mattress stitch. If you haven't done this before, it's just picking up the V of the knit stitch on both sides, and alternating until you get to the end. To close the drawstring panel on the inside, I also mattress stitch this side. Then I tied it off, and now the waistband portion is done. Now back to the Sentro, I'll work on the ruffle panel. I'm going to cast on 36 hooks with my waste yarn, and then repeat the same steps to knit a 8-row base and then switch to my working yarn. However, this time I'm going to knit 256 rows. And same as before, I'll also cast off with the waste yarn. I have a very long panel here, and I'm going to be joining the two ends with a slip stitch. So this will make a very long loop. Just make sure there aren't any twists in your panel before doing this. And I remove the waste yarn and I'm left with a clean seam. Now to join these, I put the right sides together and did my best to line up the seams. I'll be using my crochet hook to slip stitch the bottom column of stitches in the waistband and the top column of stitches in the ruffle. I'll start by slip stitching together with the waistband and ruffle panel across 3 stitches. The 4th slip stitch will be a little bit different. I'll pick up the 3rd and 5th stitch from the hook on the ruffle panel and slip stitch that with the 4th stitch on the waistband. This will create a bit of a gather and create the ruffling look, and I'll repeat that until I get to the end. So I'm slip stitching together both sides for 3 stitches. Then on the 4th, I will pick up the 3rd and 5th loop from the hook on the ruffle side and slip stitch that to the 4th stitch on the waistband. Here it is all joined together, and as usual, the last step is to sew in any loose ends. I also had these little tulip beads that I thought would be cute, so I just sewed them onto the drawstring as an accent. If you followed along and made your own skirt, let me know what you think in the comments. And if you feel like sharing it, as always, I would be so happy to see what you made. Feel free to tag me on Instagram. And I hope to see you guys in my next video. Bye for now.